Interdisciplinary Panel 1. A product developer, blind technology advocate, and computer vision researcher discuss the future of visual interpretation technologies. Moderator, Danna Gurari, Assistant Professor, University of Colorado, Boulder. Speaker, Stephanie Enyart, Chief Public Policy and Research Officer, American Foundation for the Blind. Speaker, Karthik, Kannan, Chief Technology Officer, Envision. Speaker, James Coughlin, Senior Scientist, the Smith-Kettlewell Eye Research Institute.
Hello, and welcome to the fourth panel discussion of the VizWiz workshop, everyone. My name is Danna Gurari, and I'm an assistant professor at University of Colorado, Boulder, where I also lead the Image and Video Computing Research Group. I'm really excited to have three panelists with us today who can share very diverse experiences around the development of computer vision technologies to meet the interests and needs of people with vision impairments. First, we have James Coughlin to speak with us about the cutting edge of computer vision research. He is a senior scientist at the Smith-Kettlewell Eye Research Institute, where he has worked since 1998. Over the years, he has served as a world leader in designing a wide array of impactful technologies for the blind and low vision community. We also have Karthik, Kannan to discuss the development of industry products that use computer vision to assist people with vision impairments. Karthik is the co-founder and chief technology officer of Envision, a company that builds an app and smart glasses that uses AI to describe users' visual surroundings. Finally, we have with us Stephanie Enyart to share the perspectives of people with vision impairments based on her personal experience, as well as her professional role at the American Foundation of the Blind as the chief public policy and research officer. Welcome all. It is a pleasure to have you with us. And with introductions completed, I am excited to now dive into our panel discussion. To begin our conversation today, could you please share about what has surprised you the most about progress that has taken place over the past 10 to 20 years around technologies that provide visual assistance to real-world users? And Stephanie, would you mind kicking off this conversation?
Sure. I've been using assistive technology for visual disability since the 90s. And I think that I thought at this point in terms of the trajectory of where we would be, I thought that we might actually be a little bit closer to the ways that Apple as a company has kind of built in accessibility and on a broader scale. I thought that we wouldn't be in what I see as like a very responsive sort of culture where we have, advances and we're trying to figure out how to essentially make them accessible or how companies can kind of on the back end make them accessible. I also think that assistive technology, when we're talking about some of the actual tools that people are using, I thought that we would actually be at a spot where assistive technology would probably be released with a fewer bugs that do exist in the kind of technology that people are relying on day to day. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Stephanie. Karthik, could you share a bit about your perspectives?
Sure. From my perspective, I do see that like assistive technology. For me, it's I think maybe a slightly different perspective than Stephanie, in the sense that I think now there is a little bit more focus on assistive technology, or at least over the last 5 years since we started Envision, every year progressively has put assistive technology more in the spotlight. I think a lot of people now recognize a lot of developers, a lot of engineers. Because of the big push from some of these companies, are slowly starting to be able to become more aware of assistive tech. 5 years ago, when we first started Envision and we were trying to build an app that had complete was fully compatible with VoiceOver and dynamic type and some of the other assistive technology tools out there. There was little to no documentation that I, as a developer, could find that could get me started with assistive technology. I had to talk to a lot of users and a lot of trial and error, and basically all of the assistive tech documents were really in some backlog or backward part of Apple's documentation. I'm at least glad that 5 years later, they are starting to put that more front and center. When I look at the Google I/O that happened this year, I could see that assistive tech was slowly, was at least being spoken of. Accessibility was sort of packaged as one of the innovations in many of the different tools that folks like Google or Apple announced. It's definitely not where it should be. There are still 80% of the developers that I speak to have absolutely no clue of assistive technology or the fact that these tools exist. But but I'm hoping that as we start, building newer technologies like smart glasses, I'm hoping assistive technology is front and center versus, an afterthought. That was the case with a lot of the newer technologies that have come before the current state of awareness there is. So for me, it's more that it has grown in the past 5 years only because I've been in the industry for the past 5 years, so I can see that delta of difference. But I think it's definitely at a place where people are becoming more aware.
Great. And James, would you mind sharing your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, a number of sort of pleasant surprises. When the iPhone was first released in 2007, I sort of feared that it would be completely inaccessible with the touchscreen keyboard. And of course, we found out that Apple was putting accessibility in to the whole system. And it's in fact the preferred phone for most people with visual impairments. I think the statistics say that. So sort of, amplifying what Karthik said, I mean, accessibility, I think, used to be perceived as a sort of a niche thing, a sort of a niche value. And now it's universally recognized as important. And especially younger people today with visual impairments, they just have an expectation, oh, this software or system should be accessible. If it's not, why isn't it? How soon can we fix it? And I think that's just an amazing sort of progress over the last, 15 years or so. I've been amazed at seeing, apps like Seeing AI come out, a very, powerful app that's free to end users, allowing them to get a lot of visual information. And also one cultural point I want to make about that is that any AI-based system is going to have some error modes. It's going to, make some inferences that are not quite right, or maybe in some cases very wrong. And I think that I was concerned maybe 5 years before that kind of app was released. I was concerned that there'd be tremendous backlash when AI was sort of unleashed with, warts and all. But I think people are understanding that this is, it's amazing technology. You can't expect it to be perfect. You have to work with it. And then something that's maybe slightly lower tech, doesn't necessarily involve computer vision at all. The availability of sighted assistants like Be My Eyes or Ira. That's a great match of smartphones and connectivity to sighted assistants. And I think that's just a great thing. And of course, it doesn't have to be either human or AI. You can combine them. And that's probably the most sort of promising combination to have. So those are my surprises.
Thanks. And for our next question, I'd like each of you to address, what do you see as the current limiting factor or barriers in developing better visual interpretation technologies? And Karthik, if you could start us off.
Sure. I think the current limitation is the lack of representation in some of the more popular data sets that are used in the computer vision space. Like, for example, we have ImageNet, or, if you look at something like OCR, there is the COCO, data sets and all those things. Or if I'm looking at, say, training a model that recognizes documents, there are these other popular open data sets. But all of them represent how images would be taken or perceived, by a sighted person, right? For example, we recently built a document detection AI on our smart glasses, where it basically guides a user on how to move the document so that they can take an entire they can take a picture without having to second guess whether they're holding the document at the correct distance, or is the document fully in frame or not. And when we started looking at some of the more popular data sets in this problem space to see how it is, we came across very neatly taken pictures. The document was properly framed. It was at the center, and you could go ahead and build, or you can say that particular data set was primarily collected by people who were sighted, right? Whereas when we are trying to build visual interpretation technologies for people who are visually impaired, I think, we need to have more data sets that, have them taking images and making that part of the mainstream conversation in computer vision. Because someone who is visually impaired definitely is not going to take a properly center cropped image, with the document fully in frame. They're going to take it with different angles. And when we have those data sets available, I believe the research and the models that come out of that will be accessible, quote unquote, in a way, right? Because they're also trained on these type of documents. Microsoft is doing some interesting work with the Orbit data set where they try to go ahead and ask visually impaired people to take pictures of the everyday items they use from their phone cameras and then upload them, and they made that data set open. But again, it's not a very well labeled popular data set. I mean, we've tried to work with it, and it's pretty difficult. And I wish, as accessibility takes more center stage, and as computer vision, people in the computer vision industry realize the impact that their work is having in this particular community, I wish data sets also become more inclusive.
Thank you. James, would you please go next?
Yeah, sort of following up on what I was saying before, any approach to interpreting an image that's fully automatic is going to have limitations. There, limited accuracy, maybe an inability to understand context or nuance, or maybe the domain of applicability is limited if the image is something that's just completely different from anything that was ever in the training set. And so I think that combining AI with humans in the loop is really the way to go. But once you have human in the loop, that does limit the scalability. Now you're talking about requiring people to spend time labeling images and so forth. So I think I think it's a solvable problem, but I think it goes beyond the realm of technology. And I would love to see maybe programs where human labor is paid for and subsidized, perhaps. I think it would be a wonderful opportunity for many people who want to work from the home and they have good internet, but maybe they can't leave the home. And this is, if you have, so let's say normal vision, that kind of labeling task could be great. And of course, companies like Aira have really elaborate training programs. So it's not just an informal off the cuff labeling of an image. It's something that's very well informed. So I'd like to see more systematic efforts to recognize that human in the loop labor is costly, but it's also extremely valuable. And then just another high level point, there is increasing awareness that we need descriptions of images. But just as web accessibility is now required by law, maybe we need some sort of standards for image and video accessibility, because right now it's sort of seen as an optional thing by far too many people. So it has to become a right and not a privilege.
Stephanie, would you please share any thoughts you have?
Sure. I actually want to echo part of what Karthik was speaking to, in the sense that, I recognize I am one person with a visual disability, and I certainly, in my own experience, I couldn't represent the real true diversity that there is in the community of people who are blind and low vision. So from that standpoint, I really wanted to pick up on the thread that if you're trying to create something that is going to really, bring the most number of people along, I think that you have to have a real diverse sample in those that you're engaging with in focus groups and things like that. And I know that that's very challenging to do, because one of the hats that I wear at the American Foundation for the Blind is the research piece. And what I mean by diversity is not purely kind of racial and ethnic diversity, but age diversity, socioeconomic diversity, and including in that a real range in the amount of skill level that people have in using all kinds of technology, like even cell phones, to take things like pictures, and to really be able to get to an end product that's going to serve all of these different facets. I know that it's very easy to be able to do research that touches the blind and low vision community by kind of getting the same fairly well educated, fairly well tech trained group of blind and low vision individuals to essentially test products and give you feedback. But that is actually kind of like the educated tip of the iceberg when you're talking about the full range of people and ages and experience and tech training that exist in the community. So I really hope that that is also very much engaged as people are developing things.
Thank you. I would like to now shift gears and think a little bit about the future. So for our next question, could you please describe how you envision technology will work in 10 years for interpreting visual information for real-world users? And so as an example, what kind of skills will the technology have? And also, how might that technology deliver the information? So to start us off, James, would you mind going first?
Sure. I can imagine some sort of AI assistant that, is available on your smartphone, or your Alexa, whatever, which combines all sorts of sensors, of course, like any smartphone does, video, microphone, GPS, and it would be an interactive assistant, and you could ask it questions that might relate to visual information or audio or both. And so, for instance, maybe you could ask a question like, oh, is there a place I can sit down nearby? Maybe you're in a crowded place and there are a lot of people sitting, but you're looking for an open seat. And so, if you were to make such an app sort of today, it would maybe be standalone. And maybe there would be feedback to help you, move the camera, point the camera, make sure that you're covering the full range of view. But I'm hoping that in the future, in 10 years' time, wide angle cameras, if not omnidirectional cameras, would be, standard. Because the aiming problem for a person with visual impairment is a really big one. And I don't think it's a permanent problem, but I think better hardware will improve with that, will improve that. And of course, the feedback I'm envisioning might be in audio form. That's especially useful for people with vision impairments. But also, there could be an augmented reality approach, sort of like OrCam, where you point at a piece of at a passage of text, and that text that you're reading, that you are pointing to, is being read aloud. So maybe you could gesture. If you're blind, you could, hold out your hand and say, should I be going that way or that way? And with whatever precision you want to point. If you have low vision, then maybe some sort of visual display. And we've seen this, in some of Google's products, where arrows are superimposed on the screen to guide you to a destination. Of course, in 10 years, maybe you'll be wearing some sort of, headset. I don't know. That's I'm going to be agnostic about that. But those are some of the things I'm picturing in 10 years.
Thank you. Stephanie, could you share your thoughts?
I mean, I guess, the process of being able to travel around and have a real sense of all of the details of a surrounding, we've begun to chip away at aspects of that, but I really would hope and foresee that would strengthen, so I have a complete, earbud in my ear understanding of everything that's around me. I'm not calling on people to read me menus or anything like that in a dynamic environment where, lighting can be an issue or any number of other things. So I would hope that all of those problems, so to speak, are worked through. Something that I think is kind of interesting, and it's possibly because of the life phase that I'm in where I have young children, I think that the ability to read and make sense of very messy handwriting is something that shouldn't be overseen as something to tackle. You have things like messy handwriters, from doctors and things like that. Handwriting will still continue to be a thing. And so it's part of the technology space that hasn't really been fully addressed. And, so far, that's an area where being able to really, have a computer be able to scan it and truly track it with a lot of accuracy. There is still a lot of room to be done. And I'm thinking about this because I have literally a 5-year-old. So her handwriting is atrocious. I say that with happiness that she's writing, but to be able to make sense of it is still, there's still work to be done. I also think in the autonomous vehicle space, whatever can be done to shore this sort of technology up to kind of ensure that there is a capability in the autonomous vehicle space for people who are blind and low vision. That's a factor. And so I'm wondering where there may be innovations that may have synergy in this space and in fully autonomous vehicle operation, so to speak.
Thank you. And Karthik, would you mind sharing a bit about your thoughts of the future of technology?
Sure. I think, I might be biased because, smart glasses is the world that I inhabit day in and day out. And I definitely truly believe that we would be, moving to that era where smart glasses tend to become very prevalent. And maybe they work in conjunction with phones. Maybe they eventually become standalone, because we see that, the whole messy feeling of having to point, have a phone in one hand, a cane or a guide dog in the other hand, and pointing that. We already see that with the 1,000 odd Envision glasses users, that is largely, a problem that needs to be eliminated. I think in terms of the AI, I really believe we probably would have at some point like an NLP plus computer vision, multimodal kind of a AI, which you can converse with. Like, I probably would call it like a visual assistant, very similar to like a voice assistant that Siri is today. And like what, James was also talking about, being able to query things about your natural surroundings. I think it also would be very context aware. Like, for example, right now today, if someone wants to, like, even with something as high tech as the Envision glass, someone wants to read a document, they need to explicitly say, I want to read a document with the glasses. But I'm hoping that, you just point, there is an always on camera, for better or for worse, that does become more context aware. As you just point stuff at it, it's able to interpret it. I think lastly, I also envision a future where AI is highly personalized. I think it learns more either, so now we already have a lot of things like model personalization, and all these things are starting to slowly take off. Plus we are also, I hope that these models become personalized in a more privacy first way. So when there are areas that I am really excited about, stuff like federated learning, that I wish become more mainstream, and I wish those are the kind of technology that eventually become the gold standard for personalizing AI. And lastly, I do want to see more inclusion in the data sets that become mainstream in the computer vision community. I do want to see, an image net, but then probably an image net that also includes images taken by people with a visual impairment. And we try to build data sets that are accessibility first, in a sense, and rather than, trying to always look at images from the perspective of someone who's sighted. Even though these technologies might be deployed only for people with sight, for example, we do want to at least have some of these large open data sets slowly start to address the accessibility problem as well, right? I mean, for example, even if a company like Envision today wants to build a model that, for example, recognizes a white cane or a braille display, we do have to collect all of that data by ourselves. Even if we want to use an open data set just to benchmark some models, we still have to do a lot of that work ourselves. And I think that might also discourage startups from, like us, who don't have a lot of resources, from pursuing difficult problems in the accessibility space. So these are the four things that I really look forward to. And I definitely think with, I would love to live in a wearable world where, like a visually impaired person could just wear stuff that every one of us are wearing, and is able to do things in a more hands-free and obtrusive way.
Great. I actually want to do a follow-up question on some of what Karthik was mentioning with personalization and context-aware technology. And in particular, one of the challenges I've had, and I've seen other people have in trying to design computer vision models for people with vision impairments, is trying to decide what information to include in visual interpretations. So as an example, if a blind person shares a picture of their shirt, there's a question of, should you describe the shirt, like saying it's red with some pocket and bows, or should you instead say it's dirty versus clean? And then, there's another example, which is more controversial, which is when describing people, should we be ascribing gender, race, or attributes about people's relative weight? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about how you think we should decide what information to include in a visual description. And so to start us off, Stephanie, would you mind sharing your thoughts?
Sure. And I think what I may have to say, it might be a little bit controversial in the COVID-19 era where we we do have a lot of kind of visual descriptions as we hop onto Zoom calls and congregate in spaces. I actually think that the kind of content that people begin to share about what their personal visual description isn't even the most helpful for me as someone who has a visual disability. So where people are commenting and letting me know, like what their haircut is like, or potentially if they're middle-aged, or what their shirt looks like, or potentially what's going on in the background, that they're in a home office versus elsewhere. I mean, I don't feel like that adds much value to my experience. It's true that visually, I don't have enough vision to be able to take in those sorts of nuggets of information on my own. And I am acclimated to that. I think that some of the most important content that we need to know is actually things that people have to literally volunteer themselves. So for example, the pronouns that people prefer, it's never something that computer vision would actually know. Because people may identify a certain way and, select or prefer pronouns that there is a distinction or a not easy connection between. And so I don't know if these kinds of descriptions are the kinds of descriptions that are the most useful for the blind community. I know I'm not alone, but at the same time, I think that some people have now migrated to really, truly enjoying this kind of content. I think that if there's a way to select the kinds of characteristics that are most important to you, that it might be a personal selection sort of endeavor, and that might be most useful, because I think from an organic perspective, that's really where I want things related to someone's maybe racial or ethnic identity or their age. If it's relevant, it's going to come up organically. And I kind of like that I can't necessarily visually take that in and I'm not searching for it. But where we actually have things that will make a legitimate distinction for people if we use the improper pronoun, those things always have to be volunteered. And so, or identified. And so I want to leave it there because I think that there is some tailoring that needs to be done so people like me aren't flooded with a lot of detail around this that I think is really irrelevant and is meant to be sensitive to my needs.
Thank you. Karthik, would you mind sharing your thoughts about how we should decide what to include in a visual description?
I think it's primarily about asking the users. I mean, I'm coming purely from a product development, startup mentality that's building tools for people with a visual impairment. I think it's often about asking things that matter to them when we're trying to solve a problem. And it's also about, meeting that expectation with technology and trying to manage expectations as well as to what the technology can do. A simple example is, on the glasses, we just launched a feature that helps people to be able to recognize tables in a document, right? So it detects tables, it, speaks out the content of the table for them. Now, when we started to sit down with the users and ask them like, okay, what do you want us to do? Their expectations were really high. They were like, yeah, I want to know exactly what the heading in the table is. And, I want to know if, I want to be able to interpret the table exactly like how like a sighted person would do. But unfortunately, that technology isn't there yet. Unless I spend a lot of time semantically understanding the context of a table, sometimes, headings in a table might not always be bold, right? It might just be like the same font style as the other things in the table. So how do you, just visually looking at a table, there's no way for you to interpret the heading in a table, what the heading in a particular column is, right? So that is a place where we'll have to tone down the expectations, saying that, hey, the technology can't do that yet, but what we can do is try to give you the best possible interpretation of a table in a document, right? And people are oftentimes okay with that because they know that's just how far the technology can go as of today. So I've always seen that, we need to constantly keep talking to the users, to be able to understand what their needs are. And then us as technology folks need to know if we can actually meet those expectations. If not, how do we manage those expectations? And that's where design plays a huge role, because design can really, like pad out some of the areas where technology cannot really go ahead and move things, right? So we've always observed that it's like a three-way, sort of conversation between the users, the technologists, and the designers, and then trying to constantly co-create the, ideas, and always asking for, whenever in doubt, we don't assume, we just ask, people in the community what they would want out of a particular problem, and then try to solve that.
Great. James, could you go ahead and finish us off with this question about what to include in visual descriptions?
Sure. Yeah, I want to sort of echo what Stephanie was saying about the need to tailor the information to the particular needs of the person who wants it. And, there are many different kinds of visual interpretations that you might want. I mean, for instance, audio description for a movie is going to need to record a lot of sort of quote unquote factually irrelevant details, but details that are maybe important to the plot line or to the development of a character, and as opposed to as Karthik was saying, if you have a document and there's a table in it, you kind of just want to have the ability to report all the all the numbers in the table and where they occur and all that. And I think it's just helpful to think about the range of different needs. You might be and Stephanie mentioned different maybe settings to tailor what you need. You might be in a hurry and you want just the basic information, or you might want to review it a second time and get additional details. You can imagine some people, maybe children, need simpler vocabulary in describing things. Or maybe if you're using a screen reader, you might want a more detailed description than someone who's just listening to audio description of a movie. And the other thing is that the mainstream kind of application, I think, is also kind of interesting. Situational disability, if you want to call it that. Oh, I have normal vision, but I'm outdoors. It's really sunny. I can't really watch this video too well. I can't really see what's going on. Oh, let me turn on this description feature. That could be great. And I would just note that 15 years ago, I don't think a lot of people with normal hearing used captioning, but now lots of people, I mean, I do this too, turn on captions just to reinforce, what is seen. And so maybe there'll be mainstream interests as well. So we don't necessarily have to predict all the different needs, but we have to be open to all these different needs. And just the last point I would say is that, we often think of the description as if it's some definitive description of an image or a video, but of course there are many different forms, and maybe an interactive interface is the best in many cases. So you query, maybe you get some very basic information at the get-go, but then you ask specific questions rather than the technology assuming too much about what you want to know and what you don't want to know.
Thank you. I would like to dive into one more detail that we have already talked about in this panel discussion, which is the development of data sets that represent people with vision impairments. This is a critical underpinning to developing computer vision technology and more generally AI, right? And so I was hoping to hear what are your expectations about how such data sets can be built responsibly, and also about any experience you have in building such data sets. And so Karthik, I know you've already been talking about this quite a bit, so if you could please start this conversation for us.
Yeah, I think it's about whoever's building such a data set to first truly understand the problems that they're trying to solve with this data set. For example, if it's a data set that's going to contain images of documents that are that could be trained on a document detection AI at some point, to give an example of how we went about it, I think what we first did was really understand how the users who are going to be using the model would actually be taking images themselves. And I think that was a fact-finding mission that we went on. Okay, if someone's wearing, smart glasses, how will they actually go ahead and hold a document? What kind of angles do they, hold the document in, and so on and so forth. So it's first really understanding the the data from a user point of view. And then from that point on, what we did was, we have almost like 1,000 people who are currently using the glasses across the world. So we, went and enlisted volunteers. So we said, hey, listen, we're trying to build this document detection AI, and there is actually no data set that's out there. We went ahead and took about 2,000 images ourselves using the glasses, and did and put it through the process of augmenting it and so on. If you guys want to go ahead and share your data with us to be able to build this model, that would already be like a great start for us, because then we can see how things are from your perspective. So we involved the users in that. I think they really liked it because they felt they had a say in how the data set was built, and that helped us really build a tight feedback loop. And as the data was coming in, we could see, for example, how this is to again touch on James's point of like personalization or different people having different needs. We saw people with low vision take different types of images with than people with no vision, for example, right? So again, it's important we realized it was important to even have diversity in the kind of data that we could collect for with people with different visual impairments, right? So we had to go ahead and we had to ensure that even though our users might have low vision, or some users might have no vision, we didn't really make the data set, like we didn't imbalance the data set by having just images from like people with one types of visual impairment. So that also needs to be taken care of, that you understand the problem space more deeply, that okay, there are different people who have different visual impairments, so the people who you pick to collect the data set also matters a lot, because that is how that's basically what the final AI is going to also be able to do. So for us, it was understanding the users, like the exact problems that they're going to, like the AI is going to solve, to involving them, and 3, trying to really ensure that there is enough diversity in the data set, so that we don't always go ahead and only pick one group of people to build this data set with. And I think that helped us a lot in building a very inclusive document detection data set. And we eventually ended up with tens of thousands of images, and we built an AI that could work in most lighting conditions and so on and so forth. But yes, it was months of effort to build that data set for us eventually, and I hope at some point we could be able to open that data set for other researchers to also use once we add to it over the years.
I would be super excited to use that data set when it becomes available. James, would you mind sharing your thoughts about how to build data sets responsibly, and any experience you have in building such data sets?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a high level, it's just important to remember that the data set is just part of the entire sort of process. You're trying to address some kind of need, and you're thinking about a particular population. I mean, you might aspire to helping everyone with a vision impairment, but in many cases that's not realistic. If you're relying on someone to be holding a camera, like a smartphone camera, for instance, you might not be able to get that to work with people who have hand tremors, for instance. There are many cases like that, and so I think it's important to think. To be clear on what problems are you solving, to make sure these problems are grounded in the actual needs of the people that you're trying to address in this data set, and also Karthik mentioned a feedback loop, and I've seen feedback loops in the data acquisition process along the lines of, okay, for instance, we're acquiring images for indoor navigation. And, one of the early decisions that we made was, well, there's no reason not to give the user of this, this indoor navigation app that we're developing, there's no reason not to give feedback to the user to help the user aim the camera roughly horizontal. There's not a lot of utility from a computer vision point of view if the camera is aimed toward the ground, or if it's aimed toward the lights. That's usually a bad use of imagery. And of course, for some people, it's very clear how to hold the camera roughly horizontal. Other people, that's not always so clear. It's not always so obvious. So giving feedback before you even acquire those images actually turned out to make a lot of sense. And then, of course, there's a question of, well, what exact form? So you want to iterate, and for something related in this indoor navigation app that we're developing, we offered feedback that like the very first participant said, "Oh, this feedback is so horribly annoying. I just can't work with it," and we changed it. So there's going to be a feedback loop until you get some kind of reasonable acquisition process. So there are conditions. What are the exclusion and inclusion criteria of the people who are taking this data? What are the tasks that you're having them do? In the indoor navigation setting, we've done different types of tasks, such as, I'll give you verbal directions, walk straight, turn left, that kind of thing. And you hold the camera straight ahead while you're walking. In other cases, we ask the person, just walk, explore the floor of this building as much as you can, and we'll give you, some time to do that. We'll make sure you're safe. We're not going to abandon you. And you have to look, well, are you going to get different kinds of images, based on that? So anyway, those are the sorts of things I think about in sort of making the data set acquisition, responsible process.
Thank you. And Stephanie, would you mind sharing your thoughts about how such data sets can be built responsibly?
I think it really has to do with age diversity and diversity of the types of visual disabilities, visual acuity that people have, because, that comment about someone finding the level of description or the type of description annoying probably closely ties to the level of vision that they have, the type of visual needs that they don't have met, and trying to kind of synergize with getting them the information that is a little bit out of their reach versus something that they already have access to or isn't as relevant to them. So, someone who has central vision loss may have a fairly good understanding of kind of the landscape view of things, but they can't read the fine print on something. And so they're not necessarily looking for this elaborate description. So I think you really need to zero in on, that type of vision loss that people have, as well as in terms of age is part of it related to how people actually have orientation and training and understanding of using technologies like this. So if you're including someone who's a 15-year-old in your data set and somebody who has age-related macular degeneration, you're probably, even if they have very similar levels of visual disability, you're going to have a very different kind of feedback loop from them. And so it really does need to encapsulate the fact that people enter and are part of the visual disability community at very different ages with very different levels of experience. So I know that it's really easy to be able to get people that have a high level of technical understanding to be able to participate in these sorts of endeavors. And it's harder to get people that are across the age span with varying levels of visual disability, varying levels of technology usage.
Thank you. So for our final question, this is basically us putting a bow on the fact that we are trying to help facilitate the creation of an interdisciplinary community between users of visual assistance technology, the developers, as well as the researchers. And so I would love it if each of you could just share a little bit about any conversations or collaborations you already are having across these different disciplines. So talking with different domain experts and sharing a little bit about what you find works well versus what does not work well in those collaborations or conversations. And so to start us off, James, would you please share about your thoughts?
Sure. My background is in computer vision, sort of a physics, computer science, engineering view of the world. And so early on at Smith Kettlewell, I was told, don't fall into the engineering trap that so many people do, which is just falling in love with technology and solutions. Think about real problems. Make sure you're not solving a problem that actually is not that important. And so I just like to tell that to everyone I meet who's thinking about getting involved in accessibility, because the technology is undeniably cool, and a lot of people feel that way, but that shouldn't prevent you from having conversations with the people that whose needs you want to serve. And so I'm working on a few projects. One project with a blind colleague, Brandon Biggs, to make a 3D playground map, totally accessible to playground visitors. And so the idea is, you're going to a playground. In fact, this is a playground that was sort of designed from the get-go to be very inclusive. But Brandon found when he was visiting the playground some years ago, well, maybe not as inclusive as it could be for people with visual impairments. There are a lot of fun structures, but how do you figure out what's there? You can go up to a structure and the function is not necessarily obvious right away just from feeling it, because it's not just swings and slides. There are a lot of other different things. And so his idea was, well, let's have a 3D map, and let's have audio labels so that when you touch different parts of this map, you hear a name and perhaps a description of what this thing is for. And so this is an example of a project that was originated by a colleague of mine who was blind. And so I thought it was really exciting to do a project in that way, as opposed to just saying, okay, well, I think this might be a good project. A colleague of mine at Smith Kettlewell is working on audio description, and she's working with a lot of people who are sighted who want to learn to do audio description, and they have to learn to, sort of like we were talking in the earlier question, find the content that's most appropriate to put into a video, and also to get feedback from actual end users. So I think a lot of people go into this process thinking, oh, I have a good idea of what description should be, but you need to get sort of ongoing feedback from your end users to understand, well, is this working? How can I improve my audio description? And some surprises along the way. I think initially my colleague, whose name is Charity Pitcher-Cooper, initially I think she had the feeling that audio description maybe should be prioritized for factual videos, informative videos, or educational videos. And that's certainly a very important thing. But she also came to realize by working with people in the community that there's a lot of need for sharing videos that everyone else is sharing in the sighted community. And so if that means sharing, a silly kitten video that may sound frivolous, but it's an important thing to a lot of people with vision impairment to be able to share whatever video they want with audio description. So, I think she may have had some ideas about what videos would be prioritized, but, she's learning different things. And then just a high level note, when I began my research at Smith Kettlewell, I would talk to small numbers of individuals with vision impairments, and that was very helpful. Learning about actual needs and doing usability tests, and you have to constantly iterate these things. But then at some point I realized it's also extremely helpful to talk to vision professionals. You talk to one teacher of the visually impaired at a TVI or an orientation instructor, and some of these people have been working for years, and they have the perspective of dozens or maybe even more people with vision impairments. So whereas, if you talk to, the saying is you talk to one blind person, you've spoken to one blind person and gotten their opinions. If you talk to a TVI or an O&M, very often you're going to get just a wealth of information. And so I think starting out, that it would have been helpful for me to know a bit more about that as an additional resource.
Thank you. Stephanie, could you share any thoughts about what works well versus what does not work well in collaborations and conversations?
I think that concept that you should try to look at it from all these different touch points and looking at those that are working in the, we call it the personnel prep field, those that are orientation and mobility specialists or TVIs, it gives you this wealth of information. And I know I said earlier, I represent really only myself in my own experience, and there are so many other experiences in the community to make sure that you're tracking and you're kind of, building for, because there is such a wide array of needs, experiences, et cetera. American Foundation for the Blind, we interface in so many different kinds of touch points with people in the corporate or the research space, whether we're, doing consulting work that's supporting accessibility issues that companies are facing, or we're looking at the nitty-gritty details of what standards and guidelines should exist and what that floor should be in terms of the floor of expectation and rights. We also speak with them about whether or not they're in a spot that they support advances of certain types related to the policy realm, where a lot of these details get worked out. And often it's a little bit complicated for different corporate organizations to figure out where they sit in that civil rights context of what people kind of have a right to. We talk with them about research of our own, which is more on the social and emotional aspects of the visual experience. And I think that the fact that we talk with them about all of these different things and all of these different touch points, it kind of, I'm hoping that it helps them understand that it's not purely about one thing in our community, that there's a dynamic interface here related to the way technology can enhance people's lives. And so we have a variety of conversations on various topics, but I do think that there is a knowledge gap in thinking about this as a very, very dynamic area, from kind of a rights space and also from like a user space. And so, we traverse that landscape.
Thank you. And Karthik, any final words from you on how to establish effective collaborations?
Sure. I think if you are building products for people with a visual impairment, and if you're not visually impaired yourself, I think the first thing is acknowledging that you are not the user. And so you have to be building products or literally co-creating products with the users always. And this is a cliche at this point in the whole product development world, that you have to talk to users. In other areas, of when you're building other types of products, maybe you could make some assumptions, but we've always realized that we cannot make assumptions about any of the things that we are building, and we always need to ask people. It also helps that, yes, we do have people with a visual impairment in the Envision team who are part of the whole product development process. They're not customer support people or stuff like that. They're actually part of the whole product development process. They're designers who are, constantly using the product for like day in and day out. And that already gives us a lot of ideas on collaborations. So what we have noticed works best is, when we want to first, work on a new product or a new feature, it's always best to show people rather than tell people as to like what, we are building and this is the thing. So what we usually do is we build early prototypes of the features that we want to build, invite a lot of users. I think this was pre-pandemic, but yeah, like even during the pandemic, we used to do this online, which wasn't great. But once things started opening up in the Netherlands, we started inviting people back again to the office, and just, gave them prototypes after prototypes, and for them to try it out and for them to build and give feedback on the fly. One of my favorite moments that happened this year was when we built this whole document detection AI. We literally had a computer vision engineer open the laptop, connecting the glasses to his, to his machine, and just having users try out different versions of the model that we built. So we weren't really sure whether users are going to want better, like faster models, or would they want more accurate models. And we didn't know where that sweet spot was, right? How many frames per second should we be able to process before it becomes too slow or too fast, right? That kind of assumption we cannot make ourselves. So we invited the users, gave them like 5 different glasses running 5 different types of models, and had them do that. And we also, in a way, picked users like, I really like Stephanie's idea of like picking people from completely diverse backgrounds, age, right from different age groups to people who have different levels of tech savviness, to people with different levels of visual impairment, right? So we had these 3 buckets. We picked people who were like 89, 85-year-old people whose house we went to, and we gave them prototypes of the glasses and saw how they were holding the document. And that was totally different from a 20-year-old college student who's like, completely visually impaired and has lived in the world of screen readers and Siri right from the day he was born, right? And so it's just being humble enough to understand that you're not the user. So you should go all the way to be able to get the feature right or get the product right. And I think that's something that it's accessibility, I believe, is still a very human intensive it's a very human intensive space. You have to interact with humans. You can't be this you can't sit on this developer high ivory tower and say, okay, I'm going to build something and then I'm going to expect it to be accessible. You need to talk. And I think what most people outside this industry don't realize is how welcoming this community is. When we first launched the Envision app and the Envision classes in 2017 and 2019, the first place I went to was Apple Viz, which is this really popular forum for Apple users, and just put a note out there saying, hey, we're building this thing and we'd love to get some feedback. And the next day I woke up to 500 people wanting to sign up for a beta and then give us feedback, right? I think that's something people don't realize when they start to work on accessibility, is that people in this community, in the accessibility community and disability community in general, they really would like to share their, make themselves heard. And I think if you listen to them and you understand and be humble enough to accept that you're not the user and you should work with people, it becomes so much more easier to build accessible products, right? I wish all companies and all developers would do that, right? It's as simple as that.
Well, thank you. We are now at time, so I just want to thank each of the panelists. This has been a fantastic conversation, so thank you for making the time.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.